The palace was not shaken by a speech, a controversy, or a public act of betrayal. It was shaken because Lady Louise stepped into a private royal gathering carrying the Queen's pearl tiara and calmly set it down in front of Kate. With that single move, Camilla's request was denied. Catherine was raised in significance, and the traditional balance inside the monarchy fractured more loudly than anyone had anticipated. Before we explore what this could truly mean for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an update. The entire room fell silent. Lady Louise had not asked for anyone's approval, and that was exactly what made her action so powerful. Catherine stared at the pearls as though they had suddenly become too heavy for the table holding them. Across the room, Camilla watched in complete stillness. Her expression remained composed and her hands barely moved, but the surprise passed across her face before she could fully conceal it. The Queen's pearl tiara was no ordinary piece of jewelry. It was a ceremonial treasure connected to royal history, private family confidence, and memories of the late monarch. It represented closeness. It represented acceptance. Most importantly, it carried a message that nobody in the room needed explained twice. Louise had not arrived to provoke a confrontation. She had come to fulfill a promise. According to a documented family account preserved among private household notes, Louise had written down the Queen's words exactly. Now, standing before Catherine and Camilla, she repeated them with a calmness that carried more force than anger ever could. The pearls, she explained, were intended to remain with the woman who protected the family without demanding its crown. Catherine's expression immediately shifted. She lowered her gaze toward the tiara, almost unable to respond, because those words did not feel like simple praise. They sounded like a responsibility being quietly placed into her hands. Camilla understood the meaning before anyone else dared to say it aloud. Her claim request had been formal. In royal terms, a formal request meant a written appeal submitted through the appropriate household channels rather than a casual private desire. Camilla had requested access to the tiara because her position gave her every reason to believe it could eventually belong to her. But Louise's decision completely rejected that expectation. The Queen Consort had believed royal procedure would support her position. Instead, personal memory had overridden rank, and everyone present could feel the atmosphere tighten around that realization. William noticed Camilla's reaction before Catherine did. The prince made no attempt to approach the tiara. He did not immediately defend either woman. Instead, he remained silent, and that silence seemed to confirm something of its own. William understood that Louise had selected this moment carefully. He also understood that Catherine's stunned hesitation made the gesture even stronger. And perhaps most importantly, he recognized that Camilla's rejected claim was about far more than a collection of pearls. It was about inheritance. It was about influence. And it was about which woman the palace believed could carry the monarchy's future with greater trust. Nobody moved, but the consequences had already begun. Lady Louise had placed more than a tiara before Catherine. She had placed the Queen's lingering legacy into her hands, while Camilla was forced to watch that legacy move beyond her reach. But before the tiara could ever become Catherine's triumph, the palace still had to confront those standing closest to the decision. No royal jewel belongs only to the person who eventually wears it. Such objects belong equally to history, rivalry, family bloodlines, and the private wounds of people trained their entire lives never to reveal pain publicly. Around that pearl tiara stood 4 people, each carrying a different burden. Louise carried a promise. Catherine carried disbelief. Camilla carried humiliation. And William carried the cold realization that the family would never look at this moment the same way again. Lady Louise remained composed with the quiet confidence of someone whose voice had been overlooked for far too long. She was not the loudest person present, and strangely, that made her position even more powerful. A crown jewel, in the simplest sense, is more than an expensive royal ornament. It is an object connected to family history, public status, and deeply personal meaning. That was why the pearl tiara mattered so much. It did not simply shine. It communicated. And when Louise placed it in front of Catherine, everyone understood that the Queen's trust had travelled in one unmistakable direction. Catherine felt that trust pressing heavily against her. She had never requested the pearls. She had never pursued this moment. And according to Louise, that was precisely why the gift belonged with her. Catherine continued looking at the tiara, as though accepting it might deliberately hurt someone else. Camilla noticed that hesitation, and the sight seemed to deepen a pain she could barely keep hidden. The Queen Consort had prepared her claim through official channels. Her request had gone through the palace's recognized household process rather than being casually mentioned behind closed doors. She had expected the system to protect her position. Instead, the silence surrounding her exposed it. William watched Catherine struggle with what had just happened, and he understood something nobody needed to explain. Her discomfort was not a sign of weakness. It was evidence. Catherine did not reach toward power, and somehow that made power move toward her. Camilla understood exactly the same thing. For her, however, that realization carried a very different kind of pain. The rejected request felt particularly damaging because it had been carefully prepared. And because everyone in the room knew it had been prepared properly, there was no possibility of pretending the denial had happened accidentally. Camilla had been refused directly in front of the Queen's memory. Louise finally spoke again, keeping her voice low enough that everyone instinctively listened. According to a documented private family account, she revealed that the Queen had once discussed the pearls following a family service and described them as a test of who truly understood duty without craving recognition. Catherine lowered her eyes. William became completely still. Camilla did not interrupt, but her expression hardened because those words transformed the tiara from jewelry into judgment. A ceremonial review, a private examination of royal jewels intended for future public appearances, had already brought the pearls back into quiet discussion within the household. Camilla had learned about that review. Her formal request followed soon afterward. The reality of what had happened moved through the room with remarkable speed. Louise had not acted impulsively. Catherine had not been selected randomly. William knew Charles would soon discover that the decision had effectively been made before he had any opportunity to control it. And Camilla understood that even the king's arrival could not erase what everyone had already witnessed. To understand why Louise acted with such confidence, however, the story had to return to one private moment, the moment that ultimately made this extraordinary gift inevitable. Every royal conflict has an origin hidden beneath layers of silence. This one did not begin inside a throne room or behind the doors of a council chamber. It began months earlier, following a quiet service at Windsor Chapel. Lady Louise had noticed Catherine helping a frightened young page while almost everyone else remained focused on ceremony and protocol. The Queen noticed it as well. That small act would eventually become the moment that determined the future of the pearl tiara. Louise remembered the scene with an emotion that still felt painfully fresh. The young page had nearly dropped a ceremonial cushion. A ceremonial cushion is a small formal pillow used to carry significant royal objects during services and official occasions. The boy immediately froze. He appeared terrified that one mistake might embarrass him in front of the entire royal family. Catherine reacted before anyone else. She did not draw attention to what had happened. She did not call for assistance or wait for someone to notice her kindness. Instead, she quietly steadied the boy, offered him a few reassuring words, helped him recover, and allowed him to leave the moment with his dignity protected. The Queen had witnessed everything. She had watched Catherine protect someone vulnerable while others remained concerned with rules and ceremony. That difference stayed with her. Later, during a private recorded conversation preserved within Louise's personal family notes, the monarch spoke about what genuine royal steadiness truly meant. She told Louise that duty was not demonstrated by whoever stood nearest to the crown. It was revealed by the person willing to reach towards someone in need when there was absolutely nothing to gain in return. Louise remembered those words. She never allowed herself to forget them. Catherine had no idea that such a small gesture had remained in the Queen's memory. That was precisely what made the tiara feel almost unbearable when Louise finally connected the gift to that day. Catherine believed she had simply helped a frightened young boy recover from an embarrassing mistake. Louise understood that the moment had become something much greater. It had become evidence. It showed the Queen that Catherine did not display kindness because she expected praise or recognition. Compassion appeared to come naturally to her, even when she believed nobody important was watching. But Louise carried another sentence from that same private account, and after Camilla's request emerged, those words became impossible for her to ignore. The Queen had said that the pearl tiara should never be given to someone who regarded it only as a symbol of status. In royal tradition, a tiara is more than an elaborate jeweled headpiece worn during formal occasions. It can become a family symbol, a quiet declaration of confidence, acceptance, and belonging. Louise understood that if the pearls were reassigned without anyone challenging the decision, the Queen's intended meaning could disappear beneath palace procedure. Camilla's formal claim changed everything. The Queen consort had followed the recognized channels, and Louise understood that the review process could eventually transform a deeply personal memory into little more than paperwork. Catherine remained completely unaware of the promise that had been kept hidden. Camilla, meanwhile, believed her rank could still determine the outcome. Louise found herself caught between remaining silent and betraying the promise she had carried. Silence would preserve temporary peace, but silence would also mean breaking faith with the woman whose example had shaped her. So Louise waited. She waited until a moment arrived when nobody in the room could simply turn away from what she knew. Now the truth had finally emerged, and it carried far more pain than anyone had expected. Louise had not acted because of pride. Catherine had not been selected by coincidence. Camilla's formal request had forced an old promise out of hiding, and Charles would soon have to confront the reality that the decision had already taken shape before his authority had any chance to contain it. But promises inside royal palaces rarely survive without confrontation. Camilla did not immediately raise her voice. That restraint made the atmosphere even more uncomfortable. She looked first toward Lady Louise, then toward Catherine. Finally, her eyes settled on the pearl tiara resting between them like a silent witness to everything that had just happened. When Camilla eventually spoke, her words were controlled, but the anger beneath them was unmistakable. She insisted that the pearls belonged to the position of queen, not to personal sentiment. Louise refused to step away. Catherine remained motionless. Camilla seemed to believe everyone in the room should already understand her argument without requiring further explanation. And there was a reason. The pearl tiara was not simply valuable or beautiful. Worn publicly, it could communicate who stood nearest to royal authority, who carried institutional approval, and who possessed the right to present herself as a living symbol of continuity. Catherine could feel the tension shifting toward her. She attempted to refuse the gift. Not because she questioned Louise's intentions, but because Camilla's humiliation was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Catherine quietly said that the pearls should never become something capable of dividing the family. But as she tried to withdraw, Louise gently placed her hand over Catherine's and stopped her. Louise told Catherine not to surrender something that had been intended for her. The sentence was spoken softly, yet it carried more force than an order. Camilla felt increasingly trapped because Catherine refused to fight for the tiara. That made the situation even more painful. If Catherine had eagerly reached for the pearls, Camilla could have described her behavior as ambition. If Catherine had smiled with satisfaction, Camilla could have interpreted it as hunger for status. But Catherine looked disturbed, almost apologetic, and that visible discomfort made Louise's decision appear even more sincere. Camilla recognized the danger immediately. She was not being defeated by aggression. She was being defeated by restraint. Louise then revealed the detail nobody in the room could dismiss. According to a documented private household note, Camilla's claim request had already been considered, but the Queen's personal instructions still carried a significance that no official form could simply erase. A claim request, in straightforward terms, is a formal appeal asking the palace to recognize someone's right to possess or use a royal object. Camilla had placed her confidence in that process. Louise had placed hers in a promise. Now those two beliefs had collided directly in front of the family. Neither woman looked away. William had remained silent long enough for everyone in the room to begin interpreting that silence as judgment. Then the prince finally spoke. His voice was careful and controlled, carrying the weight of someone who understood that the future of the monarchy was listening. The pearls were never a reward for rank. They were a trust placed in character. Catherine froze. Camilla's expression tightened. William had not raised his voice, yet his words seemed to end the argument more effectively than anger ever could. The confrontation had now crossed a point from which nobody could easily retreat. Louise had defended the Queen's wish. Catherine had been pushed into a position she had never requested. Camilla had been denied in a room where everyone understood exactly what that rejection represented. And then Charles arrived. He was too late to prevent the wound. But he had arrived just in time to decide which side of the monarchy would be protected. What had started as a private disagreement within the family now required royal judgment. And the king could no longer pretend that the conflict was simply about a set of pearls. Charles entered the room carrying three identities at once: father, husband, and king. Each one seemed to pull him toward a different responsibility. The pearl tiara rested on the table. Beside it lay the private note connected to the Queen's wishes. Charles read the document once. Then he read it again. Nobody spoke. Camilla watched his hands carefully. Catherine kept her eyes lowered toward the floor. Louise studied Charles's expression, waiting to see whether he would accept the truth she had brought into the room. Lady Louise had protected the private note, and its existence now forced the king to treat the situation as something far more significant than an ordinary family disagreement. In simple terms, a private note does not carry the same authority as a legal decree. It cannot legally command the monarchy, but when it comes from someone whose judgment influenced the entire royal family, its personal significance can be enormous. That was why the document mattered. It carried the Queen's voice into a room where everyone wanted the final decision. Camilla waited for Charles to restore her dignity. She did not need him to become angry. She did not need him to raise his voice. What she needed was for him to acknowledge that her request deserved consideration, that her position still mattered, and that the pearls could not simply be handed elsewhere because of personal memory. But Charles continued reading. His silence gradually became more painful than an immediate rejection. Camilla understood what that silence suggested. The king was not searching for a way to challenge Louise. He was trying to understand how to deal with what Louise had revealed. Catherine felt the pressure tightening around her. She had never requested to become the center of such a serious royal decision, yet her name now carried the weight of what appeared to be the Queen's final judgment. William remained close beside her. He was quiet, but completely alert. The prince understood that his father was deciding far more than who would possess a tiara. Charles was also deciding whether the next generation could continue believing that the monarchy valued character when rank demanded obedience. That distinction mattered because inheritance is not limited to jewelry, property, or titles. It is also about the story a family chooses to preserve about itself. Eventually, Charles lowered the note onto the table. The gesture was small, but everyone noticed it. He looked directly at Louise and asked whether the Queen had ever reconsidered her decision. Louise did not soften her response. According to a recorded conversation later described within her private family account, she had heard the monarch speak about the matter with complete certainty. Now Louise repeated that certainty with a single word. Never. For the first time, Camilla lowered her gaze. Catherine seemed to stop breathing for a moment. William continued watching without looking away. Charles understood the impossible position immediately. If he openly defended Camilla, his decision could appear to reject the Queen's wishes. But if he supported Louise, his wife's humiliation would become even deeper. The king found himself trapped between affection and legacy, between protecting the present and respecting the past. The pearl tiara had transformed into a test of his authority, and everyone in the room understood it. Charles did not announce a winner. He offered no dramatic declaration. He did not immediately comfort either side. Instead, he issued one quiet instruction that changed the entire situation. Charles ordered that the pearls remain with Catherine, honoring Louise's gift and the Queen's private wish. Camilla received the decision without protesting, but the hurt contained in her silence seemed to fill the room. Catherine did not look victorious. She looked overwhelmed. Louise appeared relieved, although grief remained visible across her face. William understood the meaning of the decision immediately. Camilla's claim had failed. And when Charles finally gave his instruction, the first consequence was not public. It was deeply personal. The rejection did not erupt through the palace like a scandal. Instead, it settled quietly like ice. Camilla left the room without the tiara, without the decision she had expected, and without the protection she had believed Charles might provide. Behind a closed door, she slowly removed her gloves one finger at a time, almost as though she were attempting to maintain control over something that had already begun slipping away. For the first time, the Queen Consort appeared truly defeated. Charles had made his decision. Nobody needed to hear it twice. The pearl tiara would remain with Catherine according to Louise's gift and the Queen's private wish. A private wish, simply explained, is not a public law or an official government command. It is a personal instruction whose emotional authority comes from the person who expressed it. That distinction mattered because monarchy frequently depends upon symbols. And when an important symbol changes hands, everyone within the palace understands that influence may have shifted alongside it. Camilla remained alone after the door closed. In the silence, humiliation finally reached her. Her request had not been postponed. It had not been returned for further consideration. It had been rejected. Instead, the procedure had been overridden by an old promise. That was what made the rejection particularly painful. She had not merely lost access to a collection of pearls. She had watched the palace accept the idea that another woman carried the late Queen's trust more convincingly. Catherine, meanwhile, felt no sense of triumph. Standing privately with William, she admitted in a quiet voice that she had never wanted Camilla to be hurt because of the gift. Catherine now understood what the tiara represented, and knowing its meaning made the pearls feel even heavier. William understood her guilt, but he also understood why Louise had refused to allow Catherine to walk away from the gift. The future king had witnessed the same contradiction everyone else had noticed. Catherine's reluctance seemed to make the Queen's choice even more meaningful. Soon afterward, an aide confirmed what those inside the room had already feared. The pearl tiara would not be included in Camilla's upcoming ceremonial wardrobe review. That decision made the rejection official within the household. A ceremonial wardrobe review is the internal palace process in which gowns, jewels, and other formal pieces are considered and prepared for future royal appearances. Removing the pearls from Camilla's list mattered because it transformed a private disappointment into an internal record. There was no longer any reason for Camilla to believe the decision might quietly be reversed. Louise refused to apologize. She did not speak harshly. That made her position even more difficult to challenge. She quietly explained that certain promises were more sacred than personal comfort. Louise knew Camilla had been hurt. She did not pretend otherwise. But she also believed that the Queen's instruction had remained hidden for far too long. Catherine listened and finally understood the full weight of being selected by someone who was no longer alive to explain the reasons herself. The palace had reached its decision. But peace did not return. Camilla carried the rejection behind a closed door. Charles carried the consequences of issuing the order. William quietly carried Catherine's guilt. Louise continued carrying the promise that had started everything. And Catherine, still shaken by a gift she had never requested, realized that one question remained unanswered. She needed to know why Louise believed she was worthy of carrying the Queen's pearls. Once the doors finally shut and the sounds of the palace disappeared into the distance, Catherine and Lady Louise sat together privately, without aides, formal titles, or anyone else watching. The tiara no longer felt like a weapon caught between two competing women. Now it was simply pearls, memories, and grief. Catherine finally asked Louise the question she had been carrying since the confrontation began. Why had Louise chosen her? Louise answered with the kind of honesty rarely spoken openly inside royal families. She explained that the Queen trusted women who could endure pain without transforming that pain into a desire for power. Catherine stared at the pearls as though they might somehow provide the answer before Louise finished speaking. She had survived everything that had happened inside the palace, but surviving the confrontation did not feel like winning. With no royal aides present, the atmosphere became unusually personal. A royal aide, in simple terms, is a staff member responsible for handling schedules, private responsibilities, and sensitive household matters. Without those people in the room, there was nobody left to stand between Catherine and Louise. No official language could soften what needed to be said. Catherine could no longer hide behind responsibility, and Louise could no longer hide behind the promise she had protected. Louise continued carefully, but she did not weaken the meaning of her words. According to a private recorded conversation later preserved within her family account, the Queen had once said that Catherine understood monarchy as service long before she viewed it as status. In simple terms, monarchy is a royal system in which tradition, public responsibility, and duty are carried through generations of one family. That distinction mattered because the pearls were not being given to Catherine merely as decoration. They were being passed to her as evidence that her service had been noticed. Catherine finally admitted what she had been unable to say in front of everyone else. She did not feel worthy. She felt guilty. And she believed accepting the tiara had placed unnecessary pain directly onto Camilla's shoulders. Catherine had never wanted another woman to feel diminished because of something she had received. Louise listened without interrupting. She understood Catherine's guilt. She understood why Catherine wanted to distance herself from the entire situation. But Louise also knew that refusing the gift would transform the Queen's final expression of confidence into another secret buried within the royal family. Louise returned to the truth she had carried for so long. She told Catherine that humility should never be mistaken for weakness. Pain did not make her undeserving. According to Louise, the Queen respected women who experienced suffering without turning it into a weapon against others. The words finally broke through Catherine's composure. For the first time, she reached toward the pearls. She did not touch them like a trophy. She did not treat them like a crown. Instead, she touched them as though they were the final warm reminder of someone who had understood her more deeply than Catherine had ever realized. Something changed in the silence between the two women. Catherine no longer viewed the tiara only through the pain caused by Camilla's rejection. She began to see it as a final message from the Queen. A message that had reached her through Louise because Louise had been determined enough to protect it. The gift still carried pain. The palace still carried the consequences of what had happened. But Catherine finally understood that certain symbols arrive surrounded by grief before they can become sources of strength. Louise did not ask Catherine to celebrate. She asked only that she accept what had been entrusted to her. Catherine slowly nodded through tears. For the first time since the confrontation began, Louise appeared genuinely relieved. It was as though the promise she had protected for so long had finally reached the person for whom it was intended. Outside those closed doors, Charles continued carrying the consequences of his decision. William carried the pressure surrounding Catherine. Camilla carried the pain of rejection. But inside that quiet room, the pearls finally stopped feeling like the center of a battle. By the following morning, however, the story was no longer confined to the royal family. It had become the image everyone seemed to be discussing. Britain awoke to one striking scene. Catherine was seen leaving a private royal entrance with Lady Louise walking beside her. Neither woman spoke. Both appeared pale and serious, carrying the weight of something that seemed far larger than an ordinary family disagreement. One major front page presented a dramatic headline: "The Pearls Choose the Future." Outside Buckingham Palace, people began gathering before sunrise. Catherine's name passed quietly through the crowd as though something significant within the monarchy had changed overnight. Catherine had made no public statement. Yet her silence seemed to make the story even louder. Lady Louise had offered no public explanation either. But seeing her walking beside Catherine appeared to communicate enough. A front page, in straightforward terms, is the main cover of a newspaper, generally reserved for the story editors believe deserves the greatest public attention. That mattered because the dispute could no longer remain hidden behind palace doors. The pearl tiara had become a national symbol before anyone within the royal household had been able to control what the public believed it represented. Broadcasters reacted quickly. One morning presenter described the situation as a symbolic rejection of Camilla's influence and a significant endorsement of Catherine's future position. A broadcaster, simply explained, is a television or radio journalist who presents information to the public and can influence how millions of people understand a developing story. Those interpretations mattered. They transformed palace silence into public judgment. Catherine received praise for her humility. Louise was praised for having the courage to defend the Queen's wishes. Camilla increasingly became portrayed as the woman standing outside the late Queen's final circle of confidence. Privately, Camilla saw the front page. She turned it face down. She could endure a difficult palace decision. She could survive an uncomfortable confrontation behind closed doors. But watching her rejection become part of a national conversation caused a different kind of pain. Camilla realized the discussion was no longer simply about whether she had wanted the pearls. The question had become why so many people believed Catherine deserved them more. That was something rank, ceremony, and silence could not easily conceal. William became increasingly concerned as the praise surrounding Catherine grew. He understood that admiration could quickly become expectation. And expectation could eventually become a burden. Catherine had accepted the tiara emotionally and reluctantly, not because she had been seeking greater status. Yet the outside world was already transforming her into a symbol of the monarchy's future. William watched the reaction expand and recognized the danger. Success within royal life often arrives carrying private suffering beneath it. Now Catherine seemed to be carrying both. The palace released a carefully controlled response before midday. Through an official written statement, the household confirmed only that the pearl tiara had been gifted according to private family wishes. An official communication, simply explained, is a carefully prepared palace message released publicly, usually intended to settle speculation without revealing unnecessary private details. But in this case, the statement seemed to have the opposite effect. It revealed just enough for the public to believe that the Queen's memory had favored Catherine. Outside Buckingham Palace, the gathering continued to grow. People began leaving white flowers and pearl-covered ribbons near the gates, transforming the developing story into a symbolic tribute to the Queen's memory. Catherine's name moved through the crowd with admiration. Louise's name followed with growing surprise. Camilla's absence from the public tribute seemed to communicate almost as much as the headlines themselves. The palace had attempted to keep the meaning limited. The public made it much broader. Eventually, the immediate noise began to settle, but the judgment forming beyond the palace gates already appeared unmistakable. Catherine had emerged as the emotional symbol of the monarchy's future. Louise had become the quiet protector of the Queen's promise. And Camilla had become a painful example of the reality that royal rank cannot always secure personal affection or trust. As public opinion continued settling around the monarchy, one conclusion remained impossible to ignore. The pearl tiara had exposed something the palace could no longer easily conceal. In the end, the pearls did not tear the monarchy apart. Instead, they revealed its priorities. Lady Louise had not attempted to create a rebellion. Catherine had not taken a royal symbol from anyone. And Camilla had not simply lost possession of a valuable jewel. The royal household had been forced to confront a principle older than ceremony itself. Crowns may be determined by rank, but legacy is determined by trust. And at that moment, the Queen's final confidence appeared to rest with Catherine. Catherine accepted the pearls with a humility that made the decision seem even more significant. She understood that receiving the tiara was an honor, but she also recognized that it connected her more deeply to the responsibilities expected of royal life. Public duty, in straightforward terms, means the responsibility carried by a member of the royal family to serve the country, preserve tradition, and represent the monarchy beyond personal emotions or private disagreements. That distinction mattered. Catherine was not merely receiving an expensive piece of jewelry. She was accepting a responsibility wrapped in memory. And everyone understood that its weight would remain with her long after public attention moved elsewhere. Lady Louise became impossible to forget because she had acted without seeking anything for herself. She did not use the Queen's memory to increase her own importance. Instead, she defended a promise because remaining silent would have been easier, but in her eyes, silence would also have meant abandoning what she had been trusted to protect. Within her documented family account, Louise had preserved the words spoken following the Windsor Chapel service. Those words ultimately gave the pearl tiara its deeper significance. Her decision demonstrated that even quieter members of the royal family could influence its direction when they protected memories others might otherwise allow to disappear. Camilla remained hurt, but she had not been erased. That distinction mattered. The Queen Consort had lost her claim to the pearls, but the monarchy had not removed her position, her rank, or her dignity. Her rejection revealed something more complicated. Rank could provide access, but rank could not automatically guarantee trust. Camilla had followed the recognized process. She had submitted her request through the appropriate channels. Yet despite doing everything formally, the pearls had still moved away from her. That contrast made the decision difficult to ignore and even harder to explain away. Charles had confirmed the direction of the monarchy's future without making a dramatic public announcement. His decision allowed the Queen's private wish to remain in place, and in doing so, it suggested that the monarchy was gradually moving toward Catherine and William through trust rather than confrontation. Emotional legitimacy, simply explained, is the deeper public and family confidence that makes authority appear deserved rather than merely inherited. That mattered because the future of the crown could not depend on rules alone. It required belief. It required symbols that people understood and accepted. And it required individuals who appeared to place responsibility ahead of personal desire. William understood the significance of his father's decision. He also understood what Catherine had now become. She was no longer simply standing beside the man expected to carry the future crown. She had been recognized as someone trusted to protect its most personal legacy. Louise had delivered the promise. Charles had allowed that promise to stand. Camilla had been required to accept the consequences. And Catherine had received the pearls not as a victory against another woman, but as a final expression of confidence connected to the Queen. The story, not with the loudest claim, not with the strongest demand, but with the woman believed to have understood duty without needing recognition. Catherine carried the tiara as a reminder that the monarchy's deepest influence does not always come from titles, ceremonies, or carefully prepared public statements. Sometimes it comes from a quiet promise preserved until the exact moment when everyone else expects it to disappear. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.